So our final speaker for today is Jo Ferguson. She's an urban ecologist and principal consultant working for the Bat Conservation Trust and Greengage Environmental. She's got 20 years of experience in looking at bats and researching bats and doing things with bats. And she's passionate about them and also about how people can connect with nature in their backyard. So over to you, Jo.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that introduction, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed the talk so far, and I feel like I've learned a lot. So I know it's up to me. I'm in the final slot. Bear with me. There's quite a lot of information, especially at the far end of this, to do with lighting. So I'll also include links to resources at the end. But I'm going to start today by giving you a little bit of an introduction to us. So the Bat Conservation Trust have been working for over 30 years, championing bats and the landscapes that support them. And that involves looking at the challenges that these landscapes present to bats and finding solutions through collaborative working. So one of the landscapes is the built environment, and this is the project that I've been managing for the last almost 10 years now. And I work with stakeholders and practitioners that influence this space, and that includes people who manage gardens, our parks and open green land. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you an introduction to what can be done in these spaces to support our bat species, but also benefit other wildlife and ensure people are engaged in this process. But I'm going to start today by introducing you to our bat species. So we're lucky enough to have 17 species of bat that breed in the UK. And bats are recorded throughout the British Isles, and that's from the rural countryside to even our most urban areas. However, as a general rule of thumb, you get less species and less numbers of bats the further north you go, and this is due to slightly harsher climatic conditions and less habitat diversity. Now, the variety of bats that you can see in the slide here reflect the range of habitats that our bats inhabit throughout the UK and how they're adapted to that environment to feed on their invertebrate prey. So all of our UK bats eat insects, and they're able to hunt a huge range of invertebrate prey because they have a really sophisticated echolocation system, and that pinpoints prey either in the air or on vegetation, and bats can even hunt spiders from their webs. So different species have different echolocation calls, and this allows them to have different hunting strategies and allows them to hunt different prey items in that environment. So you have our slower flying species, and these are very maneuverable, but they have very quiet calls that don't travel very far. So they're picking through the woodland understory, and they're looking for that really close sort of information and detail from their environment. And that would be something like which side of a web a spider might be on. Then you have our faster flying species, and they hunt at the edge of vegetation or out in our open environments. So they need calls that are louder and travel further. Oh, stop it jumping ahead for me. And this allows them to get details such as larger beetles that might be flying out of the environment. So echolocation, it generally starts at about above human hearing range, about 20 kilohertz. But this goes right the way up to sort of 120 kilohertz. And so the right equipment is needed to be able to get a glimpse into a bat's world, to be able to hear that echolocation. And that really helps us through things like citizen science understand how their populations are doing. And this is really important because bats are one of our main indicator species. So a healthy bat population in an area, it indicates that it's properly functioning, and that's for supporting the species that inhabit it, which also includes ourselves. Now, a good local environment, it can affect things like our physical and mental well-being, and it relates to issues such as poor productivity and attendance at work, at school, or even things like recovery time in hospital. Now, the benefits of nature on our health and well-being are now well documented, and so understanding if the environment is functioning properly and is able to provide that key sort of resource for the future is really important. Now, very sadly for us, many factors which have already been mentioned in the talks today, including increased urbanisation and habitat loss and impacts on our invertebrates, have really reduced bat populations and their food resources massively over the last century. So given all of this, it's really important to understand how we can support our bats and in turn how that can benefit people, especially where we need it most, and that's in our built up and our urban areas. Now, I know it can feel sometimes a bit of a mammoth task when we're thinking about how do we green our greyest places. it can sometimes almost feel like a lost cause, or that we don't really know where to start. But especially in our urban areas where space can be a premium, even small interventions and interventions on a small scale can really make a difference, because we're really trying to see the place in the landscape, and can we connect with other green spaces, particularly other gardens, and can we create those stepping stones in the landscape that our mobile urban species, particularly our bats, but also our birds and invertebrates, can really capitalise on. And although we do have public green open spaces in our urban areas, and they do need consideration and management, the importance of gardens, as we've looked at today, for our wildlife and particularly for our bats, cannot be underestimated. So one study which was carried out in Paris, it showed that despite the low proportion of private gardeners in areas, which is about 36% of total green areas, they actually contributed to almost 48% of bat habitat availability. And so this study really does demonstrate the importance of private gardens to the ecological value of our towns and cities. And it really confirms the need to have a more inclusive approach about how we're managing our spaces and what's going on locally to us. And that won't just benefit our bat species. So the habitat sort of provisions we're looking at here, it does provide foraging opportunities for things like our bats, like brown long-eared species who eat moths, and things like our soprano and common pipistrelles that will eat the small flies that hatch from water. However, it's a really nice duality, and I look at that and I talk a lot with people doing things like swift conservation, that kind of day and night duality in our spaces, that those same plants and habitats and features can also provide a great resource during the day for things like our butterflies and other invertebrates, habitats for our reptiles and amphibians, and that's both within those water bodies and also that sheltering habitat around them. So it's really about creating a diversity of habitat, and especially when we're thinking about those stepping stones, thinking about how we can link up to what's going on nearby and what is already working. If we're looking at a blank canvas in a garden, the best thing to do is to start looking at local gardens and local green spaces to see what wildlife is there already, what habitats are surviving, and how we can provide one of those linkages and really increase the diversity of habitat in an area. And I think when we're thinking about the provision of water, again, it can feel a bit daunting. We don't have space for potentially a large pond, or looking at large water bodies in our public open spaces. But even small areas of water with the right design and planning can be those little microcosms of diverse habitat. So the kind of planting we provide, it can support insect species through nectar or pollen sources, providing shelter for invertebrates both in the water and out of the water for their young. And also that last element, it can provide an interest and a sort of an attraction for people and a nice feature within a garden space. So some of the submergent or oxygenating plants, things like water violet, you might have floating or rooted or non-rooted plants such as common water crowfoot, some of your marginal or emergent plants, and thinking about diversifying the edges of a structure to allow things like water mint and some of the marsh or bog plants like marsh marigold to be able to have that damp environment around a water body. And thinking about creating diversity within a space, that same thought process can be applied to water bodies as it can to our outdoor spaces, and that's also sort of big or small. And creating structure in small areas, and that doesn't have to be a garden, it can be a balcony, it can be thinking about what can we provide that might provide, we talked about areas of long grass in being important as larval habitat, small trees and shrubs in pots, they can be moved around, that can be coppiced easily. Having an easy management process for a small space also makes it feel less overwhelming as well. So being careful about the habitats we provide and the plant species we put in. Thinking not just about the horizontal space, but the vertical. Can we add pots? Can we have them running up walls? Can we have them hanging over balconies? And within those spaces, can we think about adding food growing and growing things like herbs? So again, being able to create a space that's not just nice to be in, that is also useful as well and gives people that connection with nature. If we have small areas of fence, or gateways, being able to put up trellises and to grow climbers up it, and to really be resourceful about using every single potentially hard surface and seeing if we can add a layer of green to that. If we're lucky enough to have larger spaces and gardens, again, doubling up on where we have hard surfaces, walls and fences, by putting small hedges or shelter belts or trellises along those. If we do have areas like hedgerows, being able to diversify height by planting in trees. Again, are there areas to grow food, small beds, raised beds, even larger areas of sort of allotment planting. And then we're putting in that companion planting as well. So we're being really careful to think about not putting in pesticides and not over managing that space for what we consider to be pests, whereas what we're trying to create is that balance of habitats. Where appropriate and where the soil will take it, sections of wildflower meadow. It depends how rich the soil is, but you can also provide a sort of a midway ground of, there's loads of fantastic seed planting out there for some richer soils that will still provide a good feeding resource and nectar and pollen for our invertebrates. And then when I was talking about diversity, again, can we create a diversity even on a flat lawn? Can we create some mounds and ditches, areas that might be drier, areas that might be wetter? There really is no right answer to this. It's about being creative, seeing the space that you've got, and like I say, seeing what works locally. But once you've got the space as you like it as a starting point, seeing how things are growing, seeing what works and what doesn't, and then thinking about long term, how do we manage this space? And that's to encourage the wildlife and the bats to thrive, obviously. But if you're lucky enough, or if you're working within with community groups, or you have patches of land that are open to you as well, how can you engage people in that process? So some of these management tasks, I guess, are non-management tasks. It's leaving things in situ, not being too tidy, building structures that we can add to those sort of hollow stems for invertebrates. Can we put in bug hotels? And again, just building them out of the materials we've got available. We don't want this process to become onerous or expensive, and it's nice if it's creative and people can get involved in this process as well. Where areas have needed clearing for whatever reason, or you're managing particularly species that are becoming invasive, using that brash to create habitat piles, but also potentially to manage access as well, and to protect more sensitive areas that might have species in that are overwintering, things like hedgehogs, as we'd looked at earlier. Thinking about tasks moving into the spring, that's where you might be planting your nectar-rich plants, your trees and shrubs to provide that feeding resource. Also potentially building a water feature of whatever size, and then having that adjacent habitat as well. So as Kieran pointed out right at the very start, there's a great to have that provision of water, but we must ensure that there's safe access into and out of that for any animals that are going to be using it. And ideally, even just a small area of rough ground. We've talked about, it's been talked about a lot, that lack of tidying, and also just having longer habitat for shelter and also as a feeding resource. In the summer, we can think about potentially planting another range of nectar-rich plants, thinking about clearing areas for wildflower planting in the autumn, and anything that's cleared from an area, particularly if we're thinking about putting in wildflower seeds and we need to reduce the richness, creating compost heaps and leaving areas undisturbed. We've got insect prey that are coming out of that for bats, but also you've got areas for egg laying for reptiles, shelter for amphibians. And again, thinking about connectivity in your garden and your space, almost drawing sight lines or travel lines or connected habitats. Where might you want to have a small area of mowed lawn? Where can you leave those really nice corridors, even within your own garden, and then leading out into the wider environment? And moving into the autumn, that's a good time as it starts to cool down to be planting new trees and shrubs, thinking about varieties that provide nectar and fruiting. It was really interesting to hear about Australian studies looking at natives versus non-natives. Natives is a good place to start because we're thinking about not just the nectar and pollen, but the feeding resource, the larval resource, but also If that's not possible, then the next thing to think about is, does it provide a service for biodiversity? Does it provide a nectar or pollen resource? And can it survive in the environment that we're in? Yeah, a big sort of chunk of the discussions we're having in the built environment is, are these plants tolerant for climatic conditions that might be, as we've already talked about, very hot, then very wet, then very cold, then very dry? So there's a lot of considerations, and sometimes you'll be putting in plants and with the best will in the world they won't work. Then, you know, don't be disheartened. It's your space. See how you manage it. See what's surviving. Think about where your shade and light is in the garden. Think about where wildlife might be coming in, and be creative. And the last thing is to think about putting up bat boxes and provision for these species in suitable locations for the bats to come out of hibernations. They'll be hibernating over winter and coming out into the spring and finding these provisions. I have just said it might take a while for occupancy. If you already have an area near you that's good for bats, it might be they're already living somewhere, and it might take them a little while. So don't, again, be disheartened if they don't move in straight away. Thinking about putting bat boxes high up away from predators on a warm surface as opposed to a cool surface for bird boxes, and close to vegetation and away from lighting, which I will touch on more in a minute. However, even if your bat box isn't occupied straight away, they do have another benefit. And that's because these features we put out in our landscape are a really good way of grabbing people's attention who maybe don't know about our species and don't know that we have bats in our cities. So we've got some really nice examples of what you might have seen as sort of classic bat boxes. And that's a really nice example. You can get, even in a small crevice like that, you can get a number of our pipistrelle species. We're moving ahead with sort of our designs and some of the work that I do with the Bat Conservation Trust as part of our Roost partnership. We're looking at how we can create products for industry that work for them and also work for our bat species. And then we've got some really lovely, interesting designs, this invertebrate sort of, I wanted to call it a house, but it's more of a hotel or a mansion. And there's some really nice creative designs going on some of the development sites that grab people's attention, that bring them in, that start them engaging with these features and asking those questions. And then that next step, as we've talked about, really the importance of citizen science, not just for us as the people who want to know what's going on, but also for those people taking part, getting them out into their environment, not necessarily putting their phones down, but maybe using their phones to help them engage. I think we have to be realistic sometimes that this might be our way into people then moving on and not having the technology with them. But there's so many great apps out there that help us record what is going on. And we also have a nocturnal survey, the Sunset Survey, which is entry level at the Bat Conservation Trust, which started just asking people, can you see bats? Stand outside for an hour or stand on your balcony. Can you see bats in your local area between April and October? And because people were feeding back to us that they were seeing other species, we have added other species onto the bottom of the form. And it's just a really nice way to get people out into that environment and get them engaging with their local area, even if that is in urban areas where people may not initially expect to see anything. And that really brings me to the thread that runs through this and why I'm talking about gardening for bats and people, and that's about creating stewardship and about creating legacy. If we want to have a next generation of people that advocate for not just our bats, but for wildlife, and if we want to have healthier, happier cities, then we need to get people involved. Certainly near me in South London, there's some fantastic community orchards where people are also running beehives, and they are on those little bits of meanwhile land, these sort of spare scraps of space that maybe underwent fly tipping and had no ecological value. And now we're seeing them being taken on by local communities and putting biodiversity back into our urban areas, and then creating these stepping stones. Another aspect of this, and some of the work I've also been doing, is with local business improvement districts and helping them to see the benefits of greening their areas from an economic point of view, increasing footfall, but also from a way of providing green infrastructure that maybe creates cleaner, calmer, nicer places to be, and then also provides habitat for biodiversity. And so I think, especially from my point of view, working in the built environment, it's less about where these places are sited, but how well designed the habitat within them is. So unfortunately, you can have housing estates built where provision for wildlife is simply some bat boxes or some bird boxes, and they're considered in isolation. They're not considered to connect them to the local habitat. There's not planting for the species on site. And also there's not management regimes that allow those habitats to thrive, or maybe there's severe management regimes that actually sever and link some of those habitats. So all of those practices, they really limit how successful an area can be to support wildlife and then go on to benefit the people that live there. So a really nice example here is the Barbican Centre, right in the city of London, has this wonderful prairie planting, fantastic for invertebrates. They've got water bodies, they've recorded bats there, and it's about as highly an urban area as you could get. And the other nice thing about it is there are benches throughout this space, and you see people sitting there all year round and connecting with nature. So a really nice example about thinking, as we've been talking about, thinking about outside the box. Now, the last kind of key piece to this puzzle for really creating spaces that work for bats, and one that I've been doing a lot of research in, is thinking about the provision of dark green habitats. So I've talked a lot about connectivity, but the real thing that makes them work, particularly for our bats, is making sure that there's provision of dark green corridors to help them move through our urban environments. However, this doesn't just benefit our bat species. The access to dark skies, particularly in the last few years, wonderful projects like the CPRE's Star Count, getting people out into nature and seeing it in a completely different way in the darkness, is kind of a right that people are now sort of fighting back for. There's a lot of great free advice out there, just looking at how do we control nuisance lighting and obstructive lighting to protect people from that harm and the wider landscape, and that will always benefit sort of bats and nocturnal species. But it's important, and I'll just go through to understand why bats have such an issue with artificial lighting. And it's because bats are perfectly adapted to nocturnal environments. They do have eyesight similar to our own, so they're not blind, but when they're moving through these really dark, sometimes really cluttered environments, they're trying to navigate, they're trying to hunt, you could see how eyesight might not be that useful to them. And that's that echolocation that I mentioned earlier. It allows them to see the world in a completely uninterrupted way. And they've been adapted, but there are fossil records coming out of Eastern Europe that show that this adaptation has been around for about 50 million years. It's allowed them to outcompete daytime birds, such as your swifts and your house martins, but also to avoid daytime raptor species. So for about 50 million years, things have been great for them. They've been perfectly adapted. And then within, particularly about the last 50 years, we've completely changed the rule book. And suddenly they have this lighting around them that exposes them to that threat of predation. And that's really what we're thinking about here. Those slower flying species who are so maneuverable and so well suited to that clutter environment, if they leave that and there's lighting, then they feel that threat of predation, and it's a real threat. Peregrine falcons have been recorded hunting bats in lit cities. It gives them such a competitive advantage. Our faster flying species that are more able to tolerate moving through open spaces, they're more opportunistic in the way that they can use lit and urban areas. We thought that they had basically got away with it and they were able to access our lit areas and there weren't really any problems. And they were accessing really, we'll have all seen those sort of point light sources that were mentioned earlier, where you have insects collecting around them, particularly those with a UV or blue rich content. Now, actually, a study at the start of 2015 found that even one of our most urban species, the common pipistrelle, where there were gaps in the vegetation and lighting had been added, this did cause a barrier effect for them through the landscape. And this is really concerning when we think about how our urban areas and streets are planned, where we might have a line of really fantastic mature London plains, for example, and then we have light stands between each one. So artificial lighting, it's causing the removal of commuting habitat for our bats through cities, and it's causing impacts on our invertebrates and their feeding resources, and it's causing bats to not be able to access or move through areas that, when we've taken all that time to move from grey to green, we're now resevering with lighting, and the uptick in artificial lighting in the last 20 years has been absolutely massive. This is a very large area of research, and a lot of work has been done on it. So I'm just going as an overview, and there's some really good resources at the end that I can point you to. But essentially, when we're thinking about external lighting and what can we do about it, the first thing is to avoid it. Do we need to light our gardens? And I know it's a controversial topic, and obviously there will always be a need for things like safety and safe access. But when we're thinking about things like uplighters, do we need to be doing that in spaces where half the time it should be dark, and we should have nocturnal species there that are able to access that space peacefully? But also, as people being out in dark environments, it's a completely different way of seeing and sensing a garden and being in nature, and it is beneficial to people as well. There's a list here of considerations that can be made if we need to use lighting, and where we need to use lighting, and for how long we need to use lighting. So thinking about lighting that doesn't have a blue rich content, that isn't as attractive to insects, thinking about only putting lighting where we need it, only having it on as long as we need it. So having a security light by the back door that is very low level, that lets us see our key in the lock, get us through that door, and then turns off again. That makes sense. Having lighting that comes on and lights an entire garden for a long period of time, every time a cat walks through it, and certainly in South London here, there's a lot of that going on. We have to think about, can that really be justified? Is that helpful? And can we do cleverer things? Can we use subtle waymarking within our garden spaces to see the pathways we need to move safely, while at the same time not disturbing wildlife? And that's the external considerations and thinking about lighting in that space. And certainly as an ecologist, that's where traditionally my thoughts would be. But working in this field and working with some really excellent lighting engineers, we've been thinking about, and I've been introduced to the concept of controlling that internal light spill. And the trend now for heavily glazed houses means that light spill from inside is also a real issue. And our love of light and designing with light, the ability for that to spill out and spoil dark environments is quite high. Really simple things here. Remembering to turn off lights and close curtains if we want to have lights on. Thinking about how much glazing we're putting into new properties and new developments. Thinking about where that glazing is facing. Simple things like that can help. And then you can see this really great diagram here, which comes from our Bats and Artificial Lighting at Night guidance document, which I'll show you at the end. That shows that there can be some design discussions to be had about where we put lighting within our rooms. There's some really simple things that can be done that will benefit not just the nocturnal species in the garden, but also people nearby who might want to enjoy in their own dark spaces, and we might want to reduce that obstructive lighting. So as you can see, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of information here. I was conscious of time, but also we've got a lot of great resources, and I wanted to leave time for questions. So just a few take-homes for me. Considering what works locally for bat species, but also for people, creating a variety of invertebrate food sources, finding space for water if we can, and we've looked at it doesn't have to be a large area, thinking about that variety, using a range of plant heights. Small spaces, they can be good for wildlife. Don't be sort of put off even if you have a balcony. It's about being creative. There's a lot of great resources out there, particularly the RHS website. Avoid bringing chemicals in, and I know that we're conscious of what we put into our gardens, but a lot of garden centres will be treating their plants with chemicals, so thinking about that. Keeping habitats dark where we can, and enjoying that as well, trying to connect with our green spaces in a different way, engaging the community, and that might be your neighbours, that might be within a friends group, that might be in a local park, that might be on your estate, and thinking about what can be done as a community. And lastly, don't be too tidy, leaving areas undisturbed. And if need be, if you have questions from the local community, putting up signage and engaging people so people feel part of that conversation. I do a lot of work with management committees where they're slightly cautious of doing that, but once you start having discussions with people and making them feel part of that conversation so they understand the importance of that, you'd be surprised at how accepting people can be. And like I say, here's a few additional resources for me, and I think the links are going to be put in the chat. That's our Bats and Lighting guidance document, which was put together with the Institution of Lighting Professionals. That was released in August last year. It's a technical document for industry, but there's some useful information in there. And likewise on our artificial lighting page on our website. We have some gardening for bats resources there, some really good links on our website. Some of the bat boxes that I've talked about and the partnership scheme that I help run is also on our website under Roost. And we work with manufacturers to influence their design and get feedback from industry to make sure they're putting the best things possible out there for bats. And lastly, if I've whetted your appetite with the sort of bats and artificial lighting topic, I've put together an e-learning module. We have a range of e-learning modules for industry, but this one in particular is a really nice overview, goes a bit more in depth, some of the things I was talking about, and that can be found through our website as well, and links that have been provided. So with 2 minutes to go, I'm going to stop there and yeah, take any questions that there might be from the chat.
Thank you, Jo. That was really fascinating.